So welcome to part 2 of this video where we're making a robot head. Now in part 1 we looked at doing basic sculpting of the basic form of the head. In this part we're going to look more at doing detail work. So what I'm going to do is take my guitar string tool, that's just a tool with little loops of wire on either end, and I'm going to start cutting some detail into the sculpture. Now what I'm going to start doing is trying to highlight or accentuate areas of difference. So for example where the cheek meets the mouth, around the edges of the lips, also the eyes are prime areas that tend to have a lot of detail in them. So what I'm doing is really just accentuating those parts, sort of cutting little channels in, adding areas of detail. Now the best way to sort of get an idea about how to do this is really to look at reference. I can recommend the website 3DSK as being very useful. I mean the image I've got on screen now is from that website, and they've just got a load of great reference, mostly for people but also of other stuff. And yeah, literally just copy what you can see here. I like adding quite a lot of detail into the eyes. I think eyes are quite detailed and textured and quite interesting. It's also not too late at this stage to keep adding bits in. You can see here that I'm adding a bit more detail to the eye, just trying to bulk out the area above the eyelid and then below the eyebrow there. And again, I'm just cutting channels in here, refining the edges as I go. As you can see, I'm just taking small amounts of clay each time, trying to get sort of nice natural curves in. The thing I've sort of had in the back of my mind about this piece is that it is meant to be a manufactured metal item. It's not a real person. So I think the overall piece has a slightly angular look to it, which I wouldn't be happy with if this were meant to be an actual living being. But because it's a statue, I think the angular look of it kind of works quite well. So I'm not worried about that too much. You could argue that perhaps it being a statue, which I suppose in real life might be, say, 30 feet high, may not need the level of detail that I'm putting in, and you could probably get away with having a much less detailed sculpture. But I quite like the idea of the makers of this thing sort of putting a lot of work into it, putting a lot of detail in, trying to make it look realistic. With sculptures, there's sort of never really a point where it's actually finished. I mean, to be honest, you can kind of keep on going adding detail forever if you really want to. You just really need to step back at one point and say, okay, that's it. So once you've got to a point where you're happy with the level of detail and the overall look of your piece, you need to then come to actually smoothing it out and getting a final finish to it. Now there's only so much you can do with sculpting tools, but luckily Sculpey can be smoothed down by brushing white spirit onto it. I typically use a paintbrush to do this. And what you'll find is when you brush the white spirit on, it will start melting the surface of the sculpture. Not too much, but enough to allow you to get quite a smooth finish. So as you can see here, I'm brushing some white spirit onto the lips, and it's getting rid of the more hard-edged tool marks there. I'm then coming on to doing the rest of the face. You can actually get quite a smooth finish with this. You're not going to be able to remove really large lumps, so you need to do that with tools, but you can smooth this thing down to quite a nice extent. So when you're sculpting in details with sculpture, you can get away without worrying about the overall finish too much, because you can always come in afterwards and smooth out the edges with white spirit. You can also use it to blend small details together, which is also quite handy. So here's my finished piece. Quite happy with it. It's got a slightly angry look, perhaps. The brows down as though he's scowling. Sort of a slightly hard edge to the mouth, quite an angular look to the head. So that all looks pretty good to me. Now the previous piece had panel lines cut into it, and the way I did that was to take a razor blade, and I'm not using the sharp edge here, I'm using the back of the razor blade because it's got quite a thin but uniform line to it. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to cut in some panel lines into the sculpture, trying to be as straight and as accurate as I can be. It doesn't matter too much if you actually go off here, because you can always just cover it over again and have another go. Exactly how you do your panel lines is up to you. I like the idea of sort of breaking the piece down into sections that might make sense if you were constructing this thing in real life. So you might have it divided into several sections to make transport easier, then assemble it on site. So I'm putting a line through the centre of the face here. I think I'm probably going to have the mouth and the cheeks as separate items, as well as the eyes as well. So if you're into this sort of thing like me, then you'll likely have collected a bunch of interesting objects that you might find useful in a sculpture. I've just literally got a box of junk, and it's often, I don't know if fun's the right word, but I often wander around Tesco's looking for interesting bottles and interesting caps and things that might be useful to attach to your sculpture. So on the original model I used some of these, that's a deodorant. I quite like the handle, it's got this kind of interesting textured design to it, maybe looks a little bit like a fuel cell, something like that. I've also got a million of these are caps from hair gel bottles, and I use these as well, so I think I'm going to do the same thing here and put these on the side of the model. Because the Sculpey is going to be cooked in the oven, I can't actually leave these in the sculpture, but I'm going to put them in for reference. Just to see how it looks overall, and I'll do the same for some other bits and pieces I'm going to stick in, and then when the time comes to actually cook the sculpture, I'll take these out, we'll cook it, and then we'll glue them in permanently later on. Okay, so there's the hair gel cap sort of stuck in the side of the model. Kind of reminds me slightly of Lobot from Empire Strikes Back perhaps. Yeah, it kind of looks alright. I'm going to have a rummage around in my box of junk and see if I can find any other interesting bits that we can stick in to give it a slightly more mechanical industrial type look. So I've got a load of these. This is it's used for tattoo ink. You'd fill that with your ink and put your machine in while you're tattooing. My fiance is a tattooist, so I've got a million of these. So that looks like quite an interesting sort of thing. So I'm thinking I might just stick that on the forehead like that. Perhaps. Okay, not looking too bad, but I think it probably needs some cables and things sort of coming out of it. I'm thinking I might make this one have a little bit more mechanical detailing on the outside. The previous piece sort of looked more like a sort of manufactured engine. I'm sort of thinking this one might look nice if it has part of the engine on the outside rather than sort of having a chassis, if you see what I mean. So I'm going to sort of just place some pieces on here and see how that looks. So I've got a variety of different cables here. This is a conduit. You can get this off eBay. This is quite a thin one. You can get quite thick ones. I mean, the idea is you just put electronic cables through that to keep them all together. But it's got a nice sort of ribbed look, which you see quite a lot in sci-fi. I've also got this stuff, which is a scale braided cable. Got this from a website called Premier Miniatures, I think. I'll put a link in the video description. But that's really nice stuff. It's got a lot of detail in it. Looks quite authentic, so I think that would be quite useful as well. So this is one of many boxes of bits and pieces that I've got. I've got all sorts of bits in here. So we've got some old contact lens cases, containers. I used one of these on the previous model actually, so they've got quite a nice curved surface. Most of this stuff is actually from old VHS tapes, so these form part of the mechanism inside the tape. Where I work, we had millions of these and we had to destroy them for confidentiality purposes. So these things form part of the mechanism inside, and they're quite nice little detailed pieces, look quite mechanical industrial. So I'll see if I can try and work some of these into the final piece as well. So yeah, I've used those VHS pieces to hold a piece of conduit in place, just linked to the little pot there. I think I'd add some more mechanical detailing, but before I do that, I'm going to add some rivet holes along the sides of the panel. So the original model had a bunch of these, and just a way to represent sort of bolts or rivets. So I'm going to take the flat end of a drill bit here and just punch in basically into the clay all along the edge. Obviously takes a while. But if you're wondering how to go that fast, 10 cans of Red Bull will do you. So on the base of the original model, you can see I've got this thing here, which looks like a sort of an old rusted engine. What it actually is there's another one there. There we go. It's it's from a VHS player, and I think what it is it's part of the eject mechanism. I might be wrong, so I really just pulled the VHS player apart when I was getting these. But I thought it looked interesting. You know, got a nice bit of a nice bunch of cogs there, and a sort of pulley system, so it was quite cool. So I thought it would look nice having on the base here, and once you get a bit of rust colour on it, it really looks like a piece of old machinery that's been sitting out in the open for years. So I wondered, can I get this into the new version? I've always considered that I was going to fill the back of the head with machinery, so I thought I might have this in there. But what I'm thinking is maybe I'm going to actually cut a vent in the top of the head and have this poking through. So here's the top of the head. What I'm thinking I'm going to do is sort of just try and position this on top and figure out how exactly that's going to work. So I think what I might do is have it embedded in the head. So if I just rest it on, so you can imagine that that is going to sort of be partially protruding from the top of the head, and if you come around the back, so that will be sort of partially embedded halfway down, and then the rest of the back of the head here will be filled with additional mechanical elements. So what I'm going to do here is just mark out how wide the panel will need to be in the head. So I'm sort of looking at something like that. And what I'm going to do is carve out the clay there, but I'm going to leave, there's an armature below that, so I'm going to leave the armature in place until the sculpture is completely cooked, and then I can snip through the wire that makes up part of the armature and clear out the rest, and then actually get that painted up and glue it in. So there's a recess in the top of the head cut. It's still a little bit messy, but it's quite difficult to sculpt straight edges into clay. So what I'm going to do is cook the piece, and then I'm going to just file it down slightly to get it a bit more neat. One thing we haven't thought about really is the back of the sculpture, which as you can see is a bit of a mess. I want this to be sort of damaged and broken, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm not going to sculpt that anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wait till it's cooked, and then I'm just going to snap some pieces off to get some nice sort of natural break lines. And then, like I said before, the back of the head will be filled with mechanical detailing. So there's my finished sculpture. I've pulled out all of the plastic elements because they'll simply melt in the oven, and what I'm going to do is take that off the base. You may remember from part one that this piece is removable, so you don't need that for the final bit. However, I do need to stand it up somehow in the oven, so what I'm going to do is take one of these and just clamp it in place. Right, so there we go, that's ready for cooking. So thanks very much for watching part 2 of this video. Here you can see I'm whacking the sculpture in the oven, and what I'm doing here is just putting some foil over the top of it. This is just so the element doesn't burn the front of the sculpture. So in the next part we'll be taking the sculpture out of the oven and doing a bit of painting. Well, thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so please do subscribe if you're interested in keeping up with what's going on. You can also find out more on my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.